Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Tier Talk. I just wanted to revisit Celeste Rivas Hernandez case one more time. I know yesterday I did a video and I was a bit hesitant, but I see a lot of theories that are being put out there. I have one. I worked on this with Russ, and I'm going to give it out respectfully because I do have a theory, and nothing's 100%, but from what has been discovered and what has been leaked to the news, I think the timeline changes, and I think it's very important that I don't know. I want to give this perspective. So multiple outlets now report that when Celeste Rivas Hernandez was finally found in D4VD's abandoned Tesla at the Hollywood tow yard on September 8, 2025, her remains were decomposed, dismembered, and at least some body parts were still partially frozen and thawed inside the front trunk, so the frunk. Sources linked to the investigation says she was decapitated, her limbs were cut into sections, and those dismembered parts were reportedly partially frozen and thawed when the frunk was opened. On top of that, a Rolling Stone link source says investigators are exploring a theory that her remains were frozen or refrigerated before being wrapped in a black bag and moved into the Tesla. Let me say that again. Multiple reports now say her dismembered remains were at least partially frozen at the time of discovery. If that's accurate, this wasn't just cooler conditions slowing decomposition. This was a body that had been actively cooled or frozen and only recently moved into that car. And that's, in my mind, what blows up this entire timeline. So what does partially frozen really signal? And guys, as me and Russ were trying to figure out yesterday, I thought the dialogue traveled away from us a little bit in regards to how we can respectfully deliver it. Now I figure if we just have it targeted down a bit, it still makes sense to deliver it. So if Celeste's body parts were still partially frozen on September 8th in Los Angeles heat, that suggests a few things if those reports are true. Her remains have been kept in a very cold environment, freezer or industrial style refrigeration, at least for some period. Those remains were moved from that cold environment into the Tesla relatively close in time to discovery, likely days, not months, before September 8th. And someone wasn't just hiding a body, someone was actively managing and storing that body over time. A body does not become frozen by sitting in a car, by LA overnight temperatures, or by accident. So if these partially frozen reports hold up, that implies someone had access to a freezer or refrigeration setup big enough for dismembered remains, and someone decided when to move those remains into the front trunk or frunk of that Tesla. Now I want to talk about grounding the timeline, what's actually been reported. Grounding the timeline, what's actually been reported. Here's what mainstream outlets and LAPD have put out on record so far. Celeste's decomposed, dismembered remains were found on September 8, 2025 in the front trunk of an impounded Tesla registered to D4VD, David Anthony Burke, after tow yard workers reported a foul odor coming from the car. The Tesla had been parked on Bluebird Avenue in the Hollywood Hills for several weeks, with neighbors complaining about it sitting there, leading to a tire mark, 72 hours check on August 27th, a 72-hour parking citation on September 3rd, and a tow to Hollywood tow on September 5th, 3 days before discovery. LAPD had said she may have been dead for several weeks, and other reporting, including TMZ's commentary repeated by legal analysts, say the working theory is that she likely died sometime in the spring of 2025, months before she was found. The Los Angeles County Medical Examiner still lists the cause and manner of death as deferred, and multiple outlets now say undetermined is a likely final ruling because of decomposition plus suspected freezing. Investigators believe the body was not intact and that there was dismemberment. So that's our factual floor. Everything below this line is theory, built on top of that reporting. So this is the theory part. So a working theory is death, dismemberment, freezing, and a very late move. So let's go back to spring of 2025, when Celeste could have possibly died. LAPD operative theory, according to multiple reports, is that Celeste could have died sometime in the spring of 2025, months before her body was discovered. We don't know if that was violence, an overdose, or something else. Exactly where she was when she died, we don't know that either. For this hypothetical reconstruction, I'm going to work with what investigators are reportedly thinking. Celeste probably died in the spring in or near the orbit of David's Hollywood Hills life. So immediately after death, why dismember a body? We know from multiple outlets that her body was dismembered, decapitated, limbs cut into sections, found in a bag in the frunk. That kind of dismember also almost never happens in pure moment of panic. It usually signals an attempt to make the body easier to move and store, an attempt to obscure injuries, strangulation marks, blunt force, etc., an attempt to delay or complicate identification and cause of death findings. Search warrants have been executed at a Hollywood Hills home near where the car was parked, where David had been staying. Electronics and other evidence were seized, and the lease was reportedly broken early. It's reasonable to suspect, but not proven, that the dismemberment may have occurred at or near that home or another controlled interior space not in the car. After dismemberment, so now into a freezer or refrigerated environment. Here's where the recent partially frozen reporting matters. Hindustan Times, IBT Times, and other sightings, TMZ and Rolling Stone sources say her dismembered body parts were partially frozen and thawed in the Tesla. Investigators are exploring a theory that those remains were frozen or refrigerated before being wrapped in a black bag and moved to the car. That points to some kind of cold storage setup. We don't know if it was a large chest freezer in a garage, a commercial or industrial walk-in, a storage unit or off-site location, or a freezer controlled by a second person. But if the partially frozen leaks are reliable, the most logical inference is her remains were stored in a very cold environment for a meaningful stretch of time and then moved into the Tesla not long before discovery. Whether that storage lasted weeks or months is not confirmed anywhere. It's just what the spring death plus September discovery window could imply. Now, I want to talk about the Santa Barbara County trip. Disposal, scouting, or something else. So TMZ and follow-up coverage says investigators are looking closely at a late-night trip from Los Angeles to a remote part of Santa Barbara County in spring of 2025, made in a Tesla linked to David, D4VD. Some sources say detectives are working with the theory that Celeste's body may have been in the vehicle at some point during the trip based on Tesla's telemetry and phone data. So if you overlay that with the freezing theory, you get a few competing possibilities. Scenario A, body in the car on that trip. He and possibly someone else transported her remains towards a potential disposal site, then brought her back for reasons we don't know yet. Either it's fear, interruptions, terrain, witnesses, etc. That's theory one. Scenario B, body still in freezer, dumping other evidence. The Santa Barbara run wasn't about the body at all, but about discarding tools, clothing, or other incriminating items tied to her death and dismemberment. And scenario three, scouting only. He used that trip to scout remote areas for eventual disposal while the body remained in cold storage back in Los Angeles. Right now, there's no public confirmation which of these, if any, is correct. But the fact that investigators are marrying Tesla telemetry with phone pings and talking publicly through Mark Garagos and others about a second suspect tied to that trip tells you they think that journey is a turning point evidence, not a random drive. Now let's talk about the car on Bluebird Avenue, the parked, ticket, and towed. So this is from LA Times and ABC, but early August, Tesla appears on Bluebird Avenue in the Hollywood Hills. Residents complain about the car being left there for weeks. August 27th, parking officer marks the tires. That's the 72-hour check. September 3rd, Tesla gets a 72-hour violation citation. September 5th, car is towed to Hollywood Tow. September 8th, early morning, tow yard workers notice foul odor, calls LAPD. Frunk is eventually opened under warrant, and Celeste remains are found in a bag. That's a 3-day window from tow to discovery, and the odor is bad enough to draw attention multiple days after the car leaves the street. What's the partially frozen detail? What the partially frozen detail does to the tow yard timeline? Now plug the partial freezing into that. Hindustan Times, IBT Times, based on TMZ, says the body parts were partially frozen and thawed when the car was open. We also know the car sat at Hollywood Tow from September 5th to September 8th of 2025. LA heat plus a closed frunk is a terrible environment for keeping anything frozen. So if parts of her body was still partially frozen on September 8th, and the Tesla had been at the tow yard for 3 days, then the most conservative, logical working assumption is her remains were transferred from a very cold environment into the frunk, extremely close to that time extremely close to the time that Tesla left Bluebird Avenue, probably within a day, maybe even hours of the tow. That would mean the body was almost certainly already inside the frunk before the tow truck arrived. It's highly unlikely someone snuck into a secured impound lot, unlocked the Tesla frunk, and loaded in a partially frozen, dismembered body undetected. And the freezer or cold location was probably geographically close to where the car was parked. Otherwise, long transports in LA heat would have produced more thawing. Again, this is a theory, but it fits both the partially frozen reporting and the ticket tow discovery dates. As for the second suspect, before, during, and after, people, NBC, Hindustan Times, and others all report that investigators believe D4BD likely had help dismembering and disposing of the body, and that a second unnamed person is being scrutinized. Mark Garagos has publicly described this individual as being potentially involved before, during, and after Celeste's death. If you overlay that onto the freezing plus frunk timing logic, it makes sense. Lifting and moving deeply frozen dismembered remains is physically hard, awkward, and time sensitive. Doing it in a way that coordinates with the car being left on the street, the tow timeline, and minimizing exposure strongly suggests logistics and planning, not a solo panic job. So the second suspect's piece fits naturally into the scenario where one or more people handled the dismemberment, one or more people controlled or accessed the freezer, and one or more people helped move the bagged remains into the frunk shortly before the car was abandoned and towed. So pulling it together, it's a cautious evidence-informed theory, but putting all this together, here's a speculative but evidence-anchored theory, not a statement of fact, not a legal conclusion. September 2025, Celeste dies, cause unknown, in a context connected to D4BD's Hollywood orbit. Immediately after, instead of calling 911, someone, likely not alone, dismembers her body to make it easier to hide, store, and later move, and to complicate forensics. Following weeks, months, her dismembered remains are stored in a very cold environment, possibly frozen or deeply refrigerated, in a location controlled by D4BD, the second suspect, or both. Santa Barbara County trip in spring, that Tesla run, is either a failed or partial disposal attempt, a scouting trip, or a dump run for tools, clothing, other evidence. Investigators are actively testing these ideas using Tesla telemetry and phone data. Summer of 2025, life goes on publicly, touring, social media, while privately someone still has Celeste remains in cold storage and hasn't fully decided or hasn't been able to dispose of them. Late August, very early September 2025, facing pressure, fear of discovery, changes in housing, lease issues, or just the weight of it, they finally decide to move the frozen remains into the frunk of the Tesla, likely very close in time to when the car is left on Bluebird Avenue. August 27th to September 5th, car sits long enough to get marked, cited, and towed when the frunk sealed and a heavily decomposed, partially frozen, dismembered body slowly thawing in LA heat. So again, let me read that one again. August 27th to September 5th, car sits long enough to get marked, cited, and towed with the frunk sealed and a heavily decomposed, partially frozen, dismembered body slowly thawing in LA heat. September 8th, 2025, tow yard workers smell something wrong. Officers get a warrant, open the frunk, and find Celeste remains one day after her 15th birthday. From there, the story stops being about what the body can tell us and starts being about digital evidence, movement patterns, freezer access, and who was, where, when. Because if freezing and decomposition together makes cause of death undetermined, the question for law enforcement becomes who helped hide, freeze, move, and abandon the child's body. And what does that tell us about their responsibility for how she died? So again, it was a lot. Me and Russ broke this down yesterday. There was a lot to discuss, but in the effort to break it down, I just felt the dialogue was tough to listen to. So this is more targeted as opposed to trying to figure it out. But we'll love your thoughts. As always, guys, you like the content, please. I got buy me a cup of coffee in the link to the description or on top of my YouTube channel. As always, guys, stay safe.